Hi, Kai Rosga here. Welcome back to the weekly wrap-up brought to you by Tech Law Decoded. I took a break to focus on an article. It's about the flaws of a prediction-based antitrust enforcement framework, and I encourage you to take a look at it on the website. But for now, back to doing weekly updates on the latest in tech regulation. And this week, I will cover the latest on TikTok's sale of its US operations, Epic's antitrust lawsuit against Apple in the US, Australia's efforts to regulate Google and Facebook, and Germany's digital reforms of its national competition laws. Just a reminder, this is not legal advice and the views expressed are my own. So let's start in the US with the latest on the sale of TikTok's US operations. Earlier this summer, the US administration had ordered a ban of TikTok in the US. Ostensibly, that was due to security concerns about the company's Chinese ownership. And effectively, it forced a sale of the company's US operations. Since then, Microsoft, Walmart, and Oracle have expressed some interest. And TikTok has sued the US government over the order. And the Chinese government has gotten involved as well, having threatened a sort of retaliation, at least that's how it's seen, by threatening to ban certain US tech companies from accessing the Chinese market. And in its latest countermove, China has imposed restrictions on exporting AI technologies or algorithms out of the country, which has been reported as making it more difficult to sell TikTok's US operations to a US-based company. TikTok is now in talks with the US government to try to work some of these issues out. And it's all happening against the backdrop of a trend of digital protectionism and fraught trade relations between the US and China. Last year, for example, the US imposed restrictions on the Chinese company Huawei that made it impossible for the company to acquire US-made inputs that go into the company's phones. And China has been ramping up its domestic production as a result of things like chips used in the Huawei smartphones. So this all raises a question of whether we're seeing a sort of digital Cold War emerging. There is commentary about the emergence of a decoupling of US and Chinese technology industries and the potential for two separate ecosystems to emerge, with the rest of the world essentially having to pick a side and choose which of those ecosystems to connect itself with. So this could be the beginning of a larger trend that is worth keeping track of. Next up in the US is an antitrust lawsuit filed by Epic against Apple. Epic makes games, including Fortnite, a very popular video game, which is distributed on the App Store, among other places. And Epic filed a lawsuit against Apple, alleging that Apple prevents iPhone users from downloading Fortnite anywhere other than the App Store or paying for Fortnite without using Apple's Apple Pay. At the heart of this is the commissions that Apple charges on the App Store and Apple Pay, which can go up to 30% and be, of course, paid by the app developer. And what Epic wants to see is the iOS operating system that runs on the smartphone to be opened up for other forms of distribution and other forms of payment, more akin to what you see on the desktop operating system for Apple. Apple has responded in several ways so far in the case. First, it makes the point that app developers like Epic have alternatives for distributing their apps through, for example, the Android operating system and the Microsoft operating system and others. It also points out that Epic essentially is seeking to free ride on the benefits of using the App Store without having to pay for it. And Apple points out that iOS users have benefited tremendously from the large app offerings on the App Store, as well as the tight security and quality controls that Apple imposes on the apps. The case raises some typical issues seen in tech cases where business partnerships go sour. One of those is the drawing of the line on the antitrust duty to deal between business partners. Another is the question of where the relevant competition is occurring. Is it occurring at the point where a person buys a smartphone, which would suggest a broader market where Apple competes with Google and other big companies? Or is competition happening in a narrower market within a single phone's ecosystem? So for example, exclusively on the iOS platform. And another typical question that comes up in these cases that we're seeing here is the question of how to balance the harm to business partners, such as app developers, with the benefits to end users like consumers, and how to net those effects out and determine whether competition has actually been harmed. The case comes amidst intense scrutiny in the public and among policymakers of the digital platforms. Epic is clearly riding that wave, having, in addition to file the lawsuit, launching a major publicity campaign against Apple. And so, although the case may not end up raising truly novel questions that are legal, it certainly is difficult to predict how it will play out given the background. So that's it for the US. Let's go down under, where Australia's competition authority, the ACCC, is working on a code of conduct for digital platforms. This code of conduct would govern the dealings between news publishers on the one hand and Google and Facebook on the other. The draft code of conduct, which was published in July, has several features. First of all, it would require the digital platforms to tell publishers what data is being collected about their users. It would require the platforms to notify publishers of changes to algorithms that determine how publishers are ranked or how they appear in the news feeds of Google and Facebook. The code of conduct would also require the platforms to prioritize original work in their rankings and what they display in their news feeds over work that's being sort of regenerated by aggregator websites. And finally, and most importantly, the code of conduct would impose a process for the publishers and digital platforms to negotiate for the payment to the publishers for the use of their content on the platforms, including resorting to a binding arbitration that would determine what that payment should be. Google and Facebook are pushing back pretty heavily against this effort. Facebook has threatened to shut down its newsfeed in Australia. More recently, it's threatened to disable the function of sharing news in Australia within the Facebook app. Google, for its part, is also lobbying the Australian government with respect to the code of conduct. That includes arguing that the bargaining framework that's set out in the code is one-sided and unfair, and that it might help big media companies have too much leverage when negotiating the payment for the use of their content. The US government is also intervening and advocating on behalf of the tech companies. And both companies themselves are trying to head off the regulation. Facebook, for example, has already launched and will be expanding in other countries news feeds that share ad revenue with publishers. And Google has also announced that it will be launching a new service that pays publishers for the use of their content. The heart of the debate here is the question of whether platforms are exploiting publishers by using their content to sell advertising space, or are platforms benefiting from access to, are the publishers benefiting from access to the platform's massive user base? Whatever the answer might be, Australia is going to set an important precedent here for other jurisdictions to follow. Finally, we'll finish off in Europe. Germany is finalizing digital reforms of its national competition law. Its key provisions will have to do with the law against abuse of dominance, or what in the US is called monopolization. So, for example, the new law will, in defining whether a company is dominant, it will allow regulators to take into account whether a company has intermediation power, which basically refers to the leverage or power that a platform might have acting as a middle person on a multi-sided market. So that will be a new criteria for determining whether a company has dominance. And then on the question of whether a company has abused that dominance by engaging in abusive conduct, the new law will strengthen what's called the essential facility doctrine, so that it can include a broader requirement for dominant platforms to share their data, or to prohibit them from refusing access to that data. The changes to the competition laws in Germany will also include specific conduct rules for certain large platforms that are to be identified by Germany's competition authority. Those rules will bar conduct such as self-preferencing, which is where a platform benefits its own products or services at the expense of third parties' products or services that appear on that platform. And those conduct rules will also deal with how a platform uses data to hinder entry or expansion by competing platforms. And that would include looking at whether a platform is preventing data portability from happening. So this now goes to the German Parliament for a vote to determine whether the law will go into effect. This is quite an important development on the international stage in tech enforcement. After much talk by jurisdictions from around the world, this is sort of the first major attempt to codify the lessons learned and recommendations of various studies and reports that we've seen in the digital space by antitrust authorities around the world. The law will clearly make it easier for German regulators to go after digital platforms with some novel antitrust theories. Though, of course, the specifics will depend on how regulators enforce the law from case to case. So that's it for this week. Thanks for watching. As always, if you want to follow more on developments in tech regulation, check out my website, techlawdecoded.com. or follow me on Twitter @KaiRozga. Have a good weekend and see you next time.